Welcome to this reading on the Industrial Revolution. So looking at still big changes that are occurring in world history. This period is like 1700s to the 1800s. If you and your classmates should take the time to look at the labels on your clothing, backpacks, electronic devices, and sports equipment, you would probably conclude that China, India, and the rest of Asia must be the largest manufacturers, people that make stuff. This is true now, and it was also true in 1750. The years between 1750 and 1990 were the exception. A traveler in the period 1400 to 1750 would easily have recognized that Asia was the center of world trade and manufacturing, and that Mughal India and Ming and Qing China were the world's most prosperous economic powers. In 1500, the world's largest cities were Beijing in China, with a population of 672,000, and Vijayanagara in South India with 500,000, followed by Cairo, Samarkand, Baghdad, and Fez, all in the Middle East adjacent Central Asia area. Most of the world's larger towns were also located in India, China, and Japan. At the same time, Paris, with 250,000 inhabitants, was the largest city in Europe, about a third the size of Beijing. London, 50,000 people, Venice, 120,000 people, and Florence, 40,000 people, were among the few large European cities. Cologne, Germany, had a population of only 20,000. In fact, only about 1% of the world's population lived in cities. However, dramatic changes were in the making. Although most people lived in rural areas and struggled to find enough food for their families, by the 17th century, that is the 1600s, many peasants were working in various commercial activities. Large numbers in England, India, and China, and elsewhere, worked in cottage industries, producing cotton silk, linen, and woolen clothing. So there's some little industries, but they're mostly at home. After the integration of the Western Hemisphere, that is the Americas, into the worldwide trading network in the 15th century, a vibrant trading system spanned the entire globe. Although all regions still depended on agriculture, farming, many supported large trading and commercial groups that bought and sold textiles, precious metals, and stones, porcelain, and other manufactured goods and raw materials. Starting during the Song dynasty in the 900s to 1200s, the Chinese regularly used paper money, banking, and lines of credit. Muslim merchants also relied on partnerships, credit, banking, and entrepreneurial businessmen to increase profits. By the 18th century in Europe, that is the 1700s, a growing number of rich businessmen were powerful enough to shape national politics. These wealthy financiers were able to provide funds so their governments could satisfy their insatiable appetite for modern military weapons they used against the large land-based empires, such as the Ottoman and the Qing. In this section, we examine the Industrial Revolution, another important pattern in world history. It brought about large-scale mechanization of production that led to a shift from home-based hand manufacturing to large-scale factory production. Some historians call this breakthrough a genuine revolution, while others, noting that the movement to machinery-centered production was a long process that is still going on, prefer to use the term industrialization. Whatever we call it, the use of machines fundamentally changed the way we live. The dependence on machines was for greater production, altered our families, the relationship between women and men, our sense of time, our personal tastes in food and consumer goods, our metaphors in literature and art, the way we think about our place in the universe, and what we think is most important in life. Like the agricultural revolution, that is when we started farming as humans, about 11,000 years earlier, the Industrial Revolution not only changed the way goods were produced, but also caused people to question how the vastly increased production should be distributed, and which groups should benefit most from the benefits of the Industrial Revolution. Moreover, not unlike the agricultural revolution, the start of farming, which took thousands of years to become the major productive system of the world, the Industrial Revolution, from its beginning in the late 1700s, is still moving throughout the world. Although we still We will use both terms, industrial revolution and industrialization. We acknowledge that industrialization was not a sudden event, but a long process. It has developed from technologies and ideas that first occurred far back in history and came from many different areas. We must also understand the world context around 1750 and how factors at that time contributed to the inventions that sparked industrialization. Setting the stage. How did the quest for cheap cotton cloth lead to machines? By the 17th century, the 1600s, the European nation-states had colonized the Americas and established strong relationships with states in the Asian trading system. By 1750, some European nations also had established small territorial possessions in India, the Indonesian islands, and other locales in Asia. European colonists had developed large plantations in the Americas, worked by slaves. These plantations produced commercial goods, such as sugar, coffee, and tobacco, that Asians and other Europeans were willing to buy. These commercial crops provided Europeans with wealth that they could spend. However, Europe still had a large imbalance of trade with Asia and had to use its declining supply of silver to pay for imported goods from Asia. To address the need for money, many European nations adopted a policy called mercantilism. The mercantilist goal was to make their nation rich, and a nation's wealth was best measured in the amount of gold and silver it had. A successful nation should sell more goods than it bought. To help achieve this goal, mercantilist nations imposed high tariffs on foreign imports, forced their colonies to buy and sell only to the mother country, and insisted that all trade be carried by their own ships. Indian cotton was a special problem for Great Britain and France. In the 1600s, many European consumers preferred Indian cotton cloth. By 1750, India was producing 1/4 of the world's cotton cloth, and until 1800, India was the largest exporter of cotton cloth in the world. Europeans had an insatiable desire for Indian cloth. It was cheaper and more comfortable against the skin than the woolen and linen cloth manufactured in Europe, and much less expensive than silk. Cotton cloth also took dyes well and could be colorfully printed. Women especially liked lightweight cotton garments. One reason that India was able to produce so much cotton was its efficient agricultural system that could support large numbers of workers. In addition, European producers could not seem to master the Indian art of mordant dyeing, which created cloth of intense colors. Indian cotton production was so efficient that for a long time, European textile manufacturers had been struggling to find ways to compete with India. By the end of the 17th century, Indian luxury cloth was so prized that France, to protect its own textile industry, tried unsuccessfully to prohibit the import of this cloth. Europeans also periodically imposed tariffs on Asian exports in an attempt to keep Asian goods out of Europe. In 1707, British manufacturers convinced the British government to impose tariffs on Indian cloth. 10 years later, the French even passed laws against wearing Indian cotton or Chinese silk. They want to protect their own manufacturers. European merchants claimed that the reason Indian textiles were so much cheaper than British-made cloth was because Indian workers were paid so poorly. However, the standard of living of Indian workers was actually higher than that of British workers at the time. A main reason was that Indian farmers were harvesting about 20 bushels of grain for every bushel they planted, while English farmers were averaging only about 8 bushels for each one they planted. Indian workers also paid far less for food than British workers. Moreover, Indian agricultural wages were also higher than Britain's. One of Europe's most famous world historians has written, quote, "The cotton revolution, first in England, but very soon all over Europe, began by imitating Indian industry, went on to take revenge by catching up with it and finally outstripped it. The aim was to produce fabrics of comparable quality at cheaper prices. The only way to do that was to introduce machines, which alone could effectively compete with Indian textile workers. The solution is the focus of the scene that follows." The enclosure movement and labor. By 1750, human survival and prosperity that depended primarily on the land had begun to change, especially in England. Because one landowner might own plots of land in widely separated fields, In the 16th century, the British government introduced the enclosure movement. Its goal was to consolidate, which means put together, individual plots of land into one large, continuous area. Large landholders championed the enclosure movement because cultivating larger fields greatly increased their production. This is called producing at scale. Large plots were also more suited to the new farm machinery that was being introduced. In the process, small farmers lost their traditional rights to use common pastures, woodlands, and meadows. Despite a number of violent peasant revolts, by the end of the 1700s, nearly all British land was enclosed, with big landowners. The enclosure movement took place at the very time that new crops from the Americas were being introduced and new farm machinery was becoming available. The introduction of the potato, a vegetable that provides many of the nutrients somebody needs, fostered population increases throughout Europe, putting more pressure on the land. There's more people and still the same amount of land. Most importantly, the enclosure movement also drove thousands of English peasants from their land. Former peasants became rural laborers or framework knitters or paupers, which are people that don't have a job, looking for jobs. It wasn't difficult for British entrepreneurs to convince many former farmers and farm laborers to work making textiles instead. Textiles are cloth. As a result, the number of cottage industries increased dramatically. How can we make more cloth? English businessmen knew that if they were to compete with Asian imports, they would have to improve the machinery they used. But that involved improving iron smelting. The Assyrians, which are ancient Babylonians, as early as the 2nd millennium BCE, had used charcoal to forge iron chariots and weapons. During the Song dynasty, China had led the world in iron production. Unfortunately, the demand for charcoal had resulted in deforestation of huge areas of Chinese forest lands. By 1750, most of the English countryside had also been stripped of forests and was being cultivated. So the British did not have vast forests they could use to make charcoal, to make iron. But England did have rich coal deposits. So British inventors began searching for ways to use coal to smelt iron. In 1709, Abraham Darby, a British inventor, found that pure coal, called coke, not Coca-Cola, this is coal coke, was a reliable substitute for charcoal. Darby's coke-fired blast furnace could manufacture inexpensive cast iron. Later, John Smeaton invented a blowing machine that blasted air through the coke. However, the iron that resulted was very brittle and almost impossible to bend. Then, in 1784, Henry Cort invented a way to burn impurities from molten iron in order to produce a much stronger metal. His new approach involved stirring the molten iron with a long rod, a method called puddling. Cort's invention made Great Britain the leading producer of wrought iron, a tougher, more malleable metal. Smelting iron by using coke, made from coal, to fuel the furnace was critical to the start of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, in places like Manchester, Lancashire, and Liverpool. By 1800, England led the world in coke-smelted iron, and had gained a major advantage over all other countries that were still mainly using charcoal. Soon, large coke-driven blast furnaces near the nation's rich coal deposits dotted the northern England landscape. In 1828, James L. Neilson discovered that he could make even stronger iron if hot air instead of cold air was blown through the blast. That way he could save nearly 3 tons of coal per ton of iron. With the English discovery of coke-driven iron smelting, British craftsmen could now cheaply mass-produce gins, tools, stoves, and perhaps most importantly, new machines that made cloth. The second great challenge was to find a better source of power. Mining more coal meant digging deeper into the earth, and that required a better way to pump water from the coal mines. The answer came by transforming steam into a ready source of power. Although a French engineer living in the Netherlands invented the first steam engine, the Englishman Thomas Newcomen made the improvements that led to a functioning steam engine. When Newcomen's steam-driven pump could drain the water from British coal mines, it was inefficient and consumed a voracious amount of coal. In 1764, the Scotsman James Watt added a condenser into the engine so hot steam could escape without having to cool the cylinder. By 1795, textile manufacturers were using Watt's perfected steam engine to power cotton mills. Within the next 50 years, other inventors in Europe and in the United States were mounting steam engines on ships in 1807 and on trains, 1825. These new, faster, and cheaper modes of transport made it possible to bring widely separated resources together faster than ever before. Especially in the vast, which means big, United States, the steam engine became a crucial means of uniting a country that was as large as all of Europe. In the last decades of the 18th century, the new steam engines were powering semi-automatic machines. However, because steam could not be sent very far, workers had to work near the steam engines. As a result, the modern industrial factory was born. Humans had improved on the historic sources of power: human power, animal power, water power, and wind power. And the steam engine became the key to the start of the Industrial Revolution. Once they'd perfected efficient steam engines, the innovators focused on the textile industry, especially cotton production. In 1764, James Hargreaves, a carpenter and self-taught engineer, invented the spinning jenny, named after his wife. It was so easy to operate that even a child could run it. Maybe we'll use children to run those machines. Initially, the jenny could handle half a dozen spindles. Gradually, it was improved to handle 70 or more. But Hargreaves' machine was not sophisticated enough to spin cotton. It could only be used to make linen. Building on Hargreaves' jenny, in 1768, Richard Arkwright, who had worked as a hair dyer and wig maker, invented a water-powered spinning machine that could spin pure cotton. Arkwright placed his more complex machines in a large building near a flowing river, and in the process, he created one of the world's first mass-production factories. 6 years later, Samuel Crompton, a small farmer, merged the jenny and a water frame and named his new machine the Mule to point out its unusual parentage. Crompton's mule was lighter and simpler to operate. Soon, mechanized spinning machines began to replace the age-old spinning wheel, which had largely been the domain of women, as the term spinster suggests. His mule could spin cotton thread finer than any hand spinner. Even muslin, the finest cotton cloth made from this thread, could now be favorably competing with Indian cotton cloth. But weaving was still being done on hand looms, so it lagged far behind industrialized spinning. Developing a successful power loom was a real challenge. It was not until 1800 that James Cartwright, not James Arkwright, James Cartwright, right? Oh no, Richard Arkwright, James Cartwright, all these Brits with their similar names. Anyway, he creates this power loom. Cartwright was a country clergyman, a priest, well, not a priest, an Anglican priest, who knew nothing about the textile trader machines. Nonetheless, this improbable inventor developed a weaving machine that, along with significant advances in spinning, led to the industrialization of making cloth. With good iron to make the new machines and steam power to run them, the demand for raw cotton soared. If it hadn't been for Eli Whitney, the suppliers of cotton would not have been able to keep up with the demand because of the arduous chore of separating cotton seeds from the raw fiber. Even a skilled worker could only clean about 5 pounds of cotton a day. But in 1792, Whitney, a young American, developed the cotton gin, which could quickly separate the seeds from the cotton. One man using this new machine could now gin 1,000 pounds of cotton a day. Meanwhile, other inventors were developing new ways of dyeing and creating large rollers for mass-producing printed cloth. After Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793, England began to rely on the American South for its cotton. Cotton plantations spread from South Carolina to Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi in the area known as the New South. In 1793, the U.S. produced 500,000 bales of cotton. By 1832, just 40 years later, it was producing 300 million bales. almost all of which were grown by African slaves. So we can see slavery's role in this textile manufacturing. The hunger for raw cotton led the United States to import more slaves to grow the cotton, and production expanded dramatically. Because the southern planters relied mainly on African slave labor to produce the cotton, many Englishmen involved in the textile trade hoped for a southern victory in the American Civil War. The power loom was further improved in 1801 in France when Joseph Jacquard invented the Jacquard loom, which could be run by punch cards with digital instructions. An early computer. Interesting. After 1806, as mechanized weaving caught up with other textile producing processes, the new textile factories, powered by steam, resulted in an entirely new system of manufacturing and distribution. The Industrial Revolution was now underway, and it would quickly change the face of England and eventually the entire world. Organizing production in factories. Because workers had to work near the source of steam power, large buildings were erected to house both machines and workers. A variety of specialized workers now worked under one roof. By 1830, workers in English and American textile factories, such as weavers, spinners, carders, and fullers, were performing all the steps in cloth manufacture, from carding to dyeing, within a single building. American factory owners also housed all the various textile machineries and workers together in factories in Waltham and Lowell, Massachusetts. The first years of the factory system followed the traditional guild system. The manufacturer hired a group of journeymen and some apprentices. Workers knew the bosses who had hired them, and by and large there were cordial, which means respectful, relations between the boss and his workers. But as the number of machines and workers increased, traditional relationships began to change dramatically, and the role and status of the laborers, the workers, significantly diminished. The new entrepreneurs, the businessmen, whose workers used power machines, had enormous advantages over mill owners, whose workers were using hand spinning and looms. In India, the most productive textile manufacturing system in the world in 1760, spinners took about 500 hours to produce a pound of cotton yarn. 30 years later, the spinning mule could produce a pound of yarn in 3 hours. By 1900, 25 machine workers could produce more manufactured goods in a year than all the textile workers with their hand looms in Lancashire had produced in the entire 1700s. Wow. The factory system had another distinct advantage. Workers now required far less skill than hand loom laborers needed. Men and women, and even children, could easily be trained to run a machine. As a result, mill owners paid them much less than skilled workers had once earned. That way, the goods they're selling could be even cheaper. For the first time, English textile mill owners could undersell Indian cotton cloth. The results were astonishing. In 1710, Great Britain was a relatively poor country with a weak economy compared to India and China, and it exported only about 5,000 pounds sterling worth of cotton cloth a year. That's the British currency. By 1780, English cotton exports had risen to 344,000, and by 1800 they reached an impressive 5,400,000. Put that on a chart. Crazy. The British use of steam-powered machinery explains Great Britain's radically changed comparative advantage in the cotton export trade. Moreover, with their newfound economic power, Europeans and later Americans could finance modern armies, that means fund modern armies, that could be used to force people in distant lands to provide reliable amounts of raw materials, to buy their finished goods, and to provide labor to work on their plantations, growing commercial crops to feed the new industrial order. The demand for raw cotton to feed the smoking factories became insatiable. Because the British East India Company controlled large territories in India, the company was able to move many Indian peasants away from growing food to growing cotton. Until the early 19th century, the majority of the cotton in England processed was grown in India. All these inventions and changes led to a genuine revolution in production in the short span of about 30 years. English inventors and entrepreneurs, businessmen, people who invest their money, had at last found a way to break the Indian and Chinese historic control of the cloth industry. Although the millions of people in those two large countries did not know it at the time, inventors and innovations in faraway England would soon destroy their preeminence in world trade. That means their top position in world trade. From 1800 onwards, largely as a result of industrialization, the balance of economic power began to shift dramatically from China and India to Europe and the United States. The modern age had begun. Who will industrialize first? Until about 1750, China and India were the world's major economic powers. In that year, these two countries accounted for about 57% of the world's manufactured goods, while England produced only about 2%. All three nations had highly skilled workers, available raw materials such as cotton and silk, sufficient capital for investment in new technologies, and large supplies of iron ore and coal, the raw materials needed for industrialization. China certainly had a long and impressive history of technical expertise and a superior system of educating an elite corps of scholars who could and would have been fully capable of moving China into the industrial age. So this begs the question, why didn't China or India lead the world into the industrial age? Why is it Britain and Europe and the United States? Part of the explanation may be that in the 18th century, India and China had far and away the most successful economies in the world, so they had little incentive to change. Others have argued that both India and China had not only huge populations, but also larger numbers of highly skilled laborers than either Europe or the United States. So they had less incentive to create machines that would need fewer workers. Another possible explanation was the distribution of natural resources in China. China regularly used coal as its primary heating fuel. Its coal was mainly in the northwest, around Beijing, far away from the coastal cities. Not northwest, that's Xinjiang, not by Beijing. Far away from the coastal cities, where the bulk of manufacturing took place, and it was very expensive to move the coal long distances. Additionally, the Ming emperors had spent huge resources protecting its northern borders against nomadic invasions, and they were not very concerned about developing new commercial opportunities in the China Sea and the Indian Ocean. Even more significant, perhaps, was the fact that in 1644, the Manchus, a militaristic people with a warring tradition, had defeated the Ming and established the Qing Empire in China. The Qing was investing substantial resources in conquering areas to the west. Although they honored China's classical civilization, they did not encourage innovation or invest much in science and mathematics. China already had sophisticated ways of moving goods internally from one area to another, such as the Grand Canal, and they were not very interested in producing goods for export. Perhaps the major reason China was not the first to industrialize was its superior position in the world trading system. From 1500 to 1800, 3/4 of the world's silver, most of which had been mined in Mexico and Peru, had ended up in China. Seen from the Manchu perspective in the 1700s, everything was working so well that there was little incentive to change. The Mughal Empire in India also had a prosperous manufacturing base, highly skilled technicians, a trained workforce, and a favorable balance of trade with Europe. However, after 1707, the once powerful empire was losing its glory. As Mughal power declined, several regional groups in the subcontinent of India, had begun fighting for control. Perhaps more important, trading companies from France, the Netherlands, that is the Dutch, the VOC, and Great Britain began to occupy large chunks of Indian territory and involve themselves in the politics of the various warring factions. European colonization of India contributed to its rapid decline as a world economic power, thwarting or blocking its chance to become the source of an industrial revolution. After 1750, India, which had been the world leader in cotton cloth production, was being forced to grow raw cotton for export to feed British textile factories. Ignoring all these factors, some scholars of European history, such as Eric Jones and Michael Mann, have argued that Europe's superior culture and worldview gave Europeans the entrepreneurial, which is like investing in business, and innovative talent to achieve what Indians and Chinese were unable to accomplish. Many scholars now argue that these interpretations, based on European cultural superiority, are false. These are the concepts of the rise of the West. Why does Europe and America become so powerful? India and China were well suited to achieve commercial and manufacturing success, had it not been for the impact of European colonialism on these areas, coupled with Indian and Chinese self-satisfaction as major economic powers. The European colonists systemically deindustrialized and deurbanized India and areas of Southeast Asia, preventing these areas from joining in on the Industrial Revolution. Further, by 1840, China, although not directly colonized, was being reduced to almost complete economic domination by European nations. We'll talk about that later on. So, why did Europe lead? What best explains Europe's early industrial preeminence? One general factor may be that the Mongol invasions in the 13th century had not touched most of Europe. When European history is compared to those highly urbanized and economically advanced areas of the world that experienced Mongol domination, Europe's advantage is clear. The Mongol conquest disrupted many major centers of world production and trade, but Europe remained largely unscathed, except for the Black Death, I guess. The emergence of the European nation-states played a significant role in spurring or starting and encouraging industrial development. There was intense competition among nations such as England, France, Spain, Holland, and Portugal. Holland is another name for the Netherlands or the Dutch, that were all developing at roughly the same time. Given this ongoing competition for world power, each nation wanted to have the best army and navy and the most vibrant or productive or wealth-increasing economic system. In the process, European monarchs were forced to make alliances with their middle classes, who controlled the money and credit that the power-seeking monarchs needed. Nation-states like England that were more successful in gaining access to the resources of their middle class, bankers, investors, and entrepreneurs, had a distinct advantage. The nation-states not only needed money, each one wanted to have the best military technology possible. Their competition facilitated the development of technology and growing support for craftsmen and inventors whose innovations helped create industrial machinery. Successful European and American industrialization depended on inventors and engineers being encouraged to experiment. And these nations' governments issued patents, which are government protections for new inventions. They gave grants to inventors, and pursued policies that generally favored businessmen. But why was England first? Several factors help explain why England took the lead in the Industrial Revolution. Geography was one reason. Great Britain is located on the fringe of Europe, on the outskirts of Europe, and is separated from the European continent by water. After the age of exploration of the Americas, England's position placed it at the center of the Atlantic trade, and positioned British shipping to become strongly competitive in the burgeoning, which means thriving, beginning Atlantic Ocean trading network. After losing her American colonies in 1783, England still had access to a regular supply of cheap raw cotton grown by slaves in the southern United States, as well as cotton from India, which would become the jewel in the crown of its empire. Britain's military and economic power and its prominent place in the rivalry among European nations were also major factors in its industrialization. European nations were almost constantly at war with one another and with far-off enemies. From 1740 to 1815, Britain was competing with France for world power. But by 1763, the English had soundly defeated the French in India, in North America, and on the seas. This is the 7 Years' War, or the French and Indian War. The British Empire had become the most powerful in the world. Her impressive navy could control the sea lanes and major ports. Rule Britannia. Britannia rules the waves. Britain's military supremacy gave it a chance to pursue economic growth. From 1793 onward, Great Britain began producing guns, cannons, ammunition, military uniforms, and ships for export to other warring nations. The British Navy, probably the world's best at the time, ended the French Emperor Napoleon's dream of empire at the Great Battle at Waterloo in 1815. From that time to 1918, the end of World War I, Great Britain's world power was supreme. Britain's expanding empire in Asia was also a major reason for Britain's industrialization. From 1757 to 1777, the British expanded and solidified their empire in India. thus guaranteeing a steady flow of raw materials and a secure market for British cloth and other manufactured goods. Beyond British India, European imperialism provided money for financing new technologies and economic changes. But clearly, if England had not had ample access to domestic coal, domestic meaning stuff at home, and colonial cotton, its industrial development would have been hard to imagine. So Britain's lucky. It's got a bunch of coal, very close to the surface. Another advantage Great Britain had was the willingness of the monarchy, the aristocracy, that is the elite class, the nobility, and the middle class, the new business class, to support not only commerce and industry, but also innovations. Public opinion favored progress that seemed to increase the economic power of the state. The British government awarded medals and money grants to successful inventors and supported organizations dedicated to fostering new technologies. Inventors also gathered to share ideas and offer mutual support. The results were astonishing. Between 1660 and 1669, British inventors had applied for a meager 31 patents. But from 1760 to 1769, same amount of years, the number of patent applications had risen to 205. And in 1789, when British industrialism was in full force, the number of patents requested was 477 in 1 year. Finally, many earlier historians claim that the scientific revolution of the 1500s and 1600s, which was the foundation of modern science, was the major reason why England industrialized first. Although the newer model of the solar system with the sun at the center certainly shaped the thinking of most English people, the scientific revolution had little to do with industrialization. Most of the Englishmen who made the initial British inventions were not scientists. They ranged from instrument makers to wig makers to clergymen. Cartwright, who invented the power loom, noted, quote, "As I had never before turned my thoughts to anything mechanical, either in theory or practice, nor had ever seen a loom at work, or knew of anything of its construction, you will readily suppose that my first loom must have been a most rude piece of machinery." One eminent scholar even argues that most of the scientific discoveries had little practical use. After all, who cares if the sun or the earth is at the center of the universe? And that technological change depended, as it did in the past, on various adaptations and small-scale changes made by craftsmen and industrialists who had little or no formal scientific training. It was not until well into the 19th century, in the 1800s, in particular the discovery of electricity and magnetism, that scientific advances led to major industrial advances. Inventors such as Arkwright and Watt cannot honestly be described as scientists. Instead, they were skilled craftsmen who relied on trial and error and their own observations of how things actually worked in real life. So hopefully this reading has taught you some ideas about why the Industrial Revolution happens and how it begins to change the world. Thanks for listening. Have a great one. Bye.